Thank you all for joining me. I have a special guest. He is a global entrepreneur, author, public speaker, venture capitalist, and an overall rock star. Please help me welcome, all the way from South Africa, my brother Vusi Thembekwayo. How you doing, Vusi?
Hey, my brother, how you doing?
Doing very well. I'm so glad you could join us. Listen, we want to cover as much as we can, but you have a lot that you can share, and we want to get on to the topic of global entrepreneurship and different business practices for this current climate. But before we get into that, I have to ask you about this whole pandemic. First of all, how has it affected you guys there in South Africa?
Ooh, it's been a nightmare, man. In fact, I have been on a whirlwind of media because I posted a video where I was quite upset about something, and the video kind of went viral. It's been really, really difficult. We're seeing record levels of unemployment, highest levels of unemployment in South Africa of our recent history. We're seeing our currency come under immense pressure. We're seeing credit markets come under immense pressure. We're seeing capital markets come under huge, huge pressure. We're seeing massive amounts of layoffs and retrenchments. It's been an absolute nightmare. You have to remember that coming into this period, South Africa already was in a recession. So we were in a recession at the end of last year. We'd had 2 years of a recession in the real economy. And we saw a recession again, or a contraction in our economy in the first quarter of this year. So by the time they announced that we were going into lockdown in March of this year, many businesses were on their knees, many households were already on their knees. And this has just accelerated what's been the worst economic circumstance for South Africa, I think, in the economic life of many of us, myself included.
Wow. What are the officials, the government officials, what are they saying to the citizens during this time?
I mean, a bit of this and a bit of that. I think that some of the people in public service are really doing the best they can. I can imagine they're not sleeping at night. They're pulling in the hours. They're doing the best they can. But as other things with public service, there are also people in the state who are quite lethargic, and I think aren't understanding of how important this moment is in the lives of people. I think there are some people in government who are disconnected from the realities of the average citizen, who don't understand that there are people who are, so we didn't have a furlough program. In the UK, they had a furlough program. Everybody who was working got up to 80% of their salaries paid by the state. We didn't have that here. We didn't have that at all. So businesses have had to kind of support themselves, and the state made available an unemployment insurance fund program. But there's been delays with that too for people to get paid. I know because some of my own people have been affected by that. So, I think what this has done is it's really shown the fault line of where the state does deliver and where the state does not deliver for many citizens. And it's accelerated the level of frustration that many citizens were feeling.
We can talk forever about pandemic as it pertains to COVID-19, but I know here in America and many of our other neighboring countries, we have seen another crisis arise, and that is the one on racism. Tell me, do you experience or have you experienced any racism in South Africa? Does that exist at all?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that the history of South Africa is laden with racism, and inequality, structural inequality built into the system along the lines of race. It's laden with it. And so, as a mechanism to distort that and to try and correct some of those distortions in the system, we have legislations which themselves are race-based, in my view, necessarily so. But we also have legislations which themselves are race-based to try and redress some of the injustices of the past. But like every other country, I think that is battling for a voice. I think that's really where we are. I think that everybody's battling for a voice. People want to be heard. And people want to be heard in the language that they want to speak, not the language that everybody wants to listen to. And so, if you find violent protests, you'll find violent protests precisely because that's the language people want to speak at that time. I saw a very emotional video, it almost made me tear up, of a lady in, I think it was Connecticut, and there were some protests around Black Lives Matter, and they were burning a store, and somebody said to her, "Why would you burn the store?" And she said, well, first, my ancestors built this place. So, you know, I have right to that asset. And she said, second, I burned the store because even though it exists, I'm not part of the economy. So there's nothing for me to protect here. And I think that's a lesson for the people in classes of capital and power, to recognize that any system that doesn't work for the majority of its people sooner or later faces an expiry date. And that's not a comment about whether or not that behavior is correct, but it is a comment about reflecting on whether or not people feel they have a part of the equity in the system. If you don't feel like you have a part of equity in any system, you don't feel obliged to protect it. And so its destruction is of no consequence to you. And I think a lot of us the world over are having to really ask ourselves questions around inclusion. Inclusion based on race, inclusion based on tribe, inclusion based on gender, inclusion based on sexual orientation. This is why the whole world is the way it is. This is why there is, you know, everybody coming out of their own corners and going, I don't want to be in a corner anymore. I want to be considered too. I want to be part of the mainstream. And until we deal with that, we're not going to find peace. And I suggest that we get dealing with it very quickly.
Mm. We know we vote, and we know there's some legislation that has to change. But beyond that, as Black people, what can we do to position ourselves? Even now, before so-and-so's out of office or before they've written a new bill, how can we position ourselves right now in your vantage point?
I mean, that's a great question. And I have to admit that I think that the answer to that question is very nuanced, because the Black condition is universal, but the Black experience is geographic, right? Mm. So the Black condition is universal. The oppression of Black people is a universal experience. That's why when a knee is put on George Floyd's neck all over the world, we get it. We get it. Because even though we might, in South Africa, we don't necessarily suffer the levels of police brutality. That doesn't say, it's not to say they don't exist, but we don't have the levels of police brutality that you guys experience in the US. Even though that's the case, we still have an economy that excludes us, and that is structurally built for our exclusion. So, you know, when the Reverend Del Sharpton says, we know what that neck means, we get it. We know exactly what that neck means. So the Black condition is universal, but the Black experience is very geographic. And I think what we need to do as a race group is to begin to architecture solutions based on our experiences, not based on our condition. We know the condition, but we need to architecture solutions based on our experience. And that experience is different for me in South Africa as it is for somebody a couple of thousand kilometers away in Zimbabwe. And, you know, it's because of the economics of Zimbabwe. It's because of the politics of Zimbabwe. It's because of where Zimbabwe finds itself. And unless the Black people and the people of Zimbabwe get around the proverbial fire and have a conversation about what do these experiences mean for us and how do we change that, it's very difficult for anybody to have a universal point of view about what needs to be done. I do want to add something very quickly. Our biggest weakness as a people is that we continue to be disconnected. And until we address that, we're going to have very big problems. You know, so I have friends of mine, guys like Camille, who run something called MyPad, it's the most influential people of African descent. And he pulls together a group of 100 of us every year, and people from different parts of the world who are all of African descent doing different things with a single moniker: connect to each other, work with each other, leverage each other, learn from each other, connect each other, build with each other. And if we don't do that, you know, yours and my kids will inherit exactly the same condition, and yours and my kids will live in exactly the same experiences.
Very well said. I have to ask, in South Africa, what is the perspective of our U.S. administration at this current time? How do they in South Africa perceive what we are enduring here?
I can't comment. I think there are people in official office who have who are far better positioned to comment than I. I mean, you know, as a private citizen, I watch sometimes, and I have to take put some gin in my cup of coffee just to let it sink in. But I don't want to comment on that. I can't comment.
I got you. I understand.
I suspect you understand that my not commenting is the comment, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. As it pertains to entrepreneurship, let's dig into that. You have been an entrepreneur for much of your adult life, if not all. It's my understanding that you earned your first million at the age of 23. Talk to us about that journey.
By God's grace, you know. So I suffered what many young Black people in South Africa suffer, what many young Black people in Africa suffer. You know, my continent, and I love it dearly. You know, literally the logo of my company is the African continent connected by dots, because I believe that this is the birthplace of mankind. It's the future of mankind. But if we as Africans don't connect ourselves, then there's no future for mankind. Isn't that powerful? Right.
Yes.
So you know, but my continent is incredibly ageist. You look at the people in power, you look at the people in political office, you look at the ages of those people, you look at the average age of people in parliament and people passing laws. And because it's so, and then you go to corporate sector and you look at the people who are CEOs of large organizations and large corporates. You know, we're not likely to have a Mark Zuckerberg here. We're not likely to have those kind of stories, because it's difficult for young people to be given the room and then to be given the support to build those kind of things, right? And so that's why many young Africans, many talented young Africans find themselves living in the diaspora, because they're in search of those opportunities. They really want to explore their strength, their time, their talent, their abilities, and their capabilities, but often they're not given the space to do that in our beautiful continent. And until we address that, we're going to have a very big problem. So the question you asked was around my journey. I lost my father when I was 13 years old. South Africa has, since the birth of our democracy, the truth is, even before then, South Africa has suffered a crime problem. And it accelerated around the 90s, the 1990s, and even the early 2000s. It got really, really bad. And my father was brutally gunned down. My father was shot 9 times for a cell phone. And they never caught the perpetrators. The police docket, you know, the document was lost by the police. My story, by the way, is not altogether unique. It's the quintessential experience, unfortunately, for many of us who come from these places called townships, which really were concentration camps built for Black people during the days of apartheid. So, you know, so I grow up and I go to an amazing, amazing school. At the time, there was an amalgamation of our schooling system, because South Africa used to have a white schooling system and a Black schooling system. So we were divided by race. And then with the miracle of 1994, the presidency of Nelson Mandela, the collapsing of the segregation of education, we were allowed opportunities to get into those schools. So I went to a school which is called Model C. Model C simply meant that the school was a mixed private and public. And I had the most amazing opportunity going to that school. And then immediately after the school, I went to university. My mom couldn't afford to pay for. We call it university. You guys call it college. And so I had to drop out. We have something called financial exclusion, which basically means the university sends you a letter saying you can't continue because you haven't been able to pay your fees. And so, you know, I then kind of went about and went, well, you know, I'm 19 years old. What am I going to do now? By God's incredible grace, I had been doing public speaking when I was at high school and had the opportunity to travel the world. And I'd met some good people while I was traveling the world. I spent some time in Australia, spent some time in the US and the UK, in Brazil and many other places. And so I thought that I'm going to start a business. And at the time, South Africa had a problem with youth unemployment. And my business was finding young unemployed South Africans jobs in the rest of the world. That's what I did, and that's how I made my first million. The business called GPSA, Global Professionals South Africa. And I learned an awful lot in that time. I learned an awful lot about myself. I learned an awful lot about my people. I learned an awful lot about the environment that I live in and how to be empathetic and conscious of people's circumstances. I'll never forget one of the most revolutionary things I did for my office at the time was I bought a shoe shining kit that I had sitting at reception, because many, particularly young Black people coming from these townships, traveled tens of kilometers. And by the time you get to the office, your shoes don't shine. And you know, if you're going into an interview, you want to make an impression, you want to make sure that your shoes shine, right? So those kind of small subtleties were a big part of what enabled me to build an empathetic approach to business, that the idea that good business is actually good business.
Yes, sir. We have to define, as we move further into the topic of entrepreneurship, many have their own idea of what it is. Some think it's being able to just cook a meal and sell it, or being able to serve certain kind of things to the public. Being that you have traveled quite a bit in the business space, how do you define entrepreneurship?
Whew. I mean, I think that, by the way, there is a difference between an entrepreneur and a business owner, in my view. You know, I think business owners sell products, entrepreneurs solve problems. And what we're learning about a period exactly like this coronavirus COVID period is often the problems we thought we were solving have changed. And now you're seeing the difference between the business owners and the entrepreneurs, because the business owners are spending their time trying to retrofit reality into their plans. The entrepreneurs are spending their time coming up with new plans for this new reality. And, you know, it's an age-old story about how large companies go out of business. What creates a Kodak, a Smith Corona, a Nokia? It's precisely because people get into the mode of selling product rather than the mode of trying to solve problems. And if you base your business and your ideology around solving a problem, then the business you're in will change, but you'll always be in a business.
So good, so good. Speaking of solving a problem, in this climate, we have a lot of current business owners that are trying to keep their head above water. And then we have a whole other group that are jumping out and leaping into the deep to now embrace their entrepreneurial ventures. You give several keys in a recent article as pertains to how to navigate this space as a business owner. And one of the things you say is to conserve cash. Explain that and give us your reasoning behind that.
So I think the single most important thing for any person in this thing called a business right now is cash float, not cash flow. Those two things are different. Cash flow is the financial modeling around the inflows and outflows of cash in your business. Cash float is the amount of money in your bank account, right? So what I'm arguing with many entrepreneurs for right now is conserve cash. And that means bulk up your cash float. So if there's something you don't have to spend on right now, if there is a campaign you don't have to spend on right now, if there are costs, I've just gone on an incredibly aggressive cost-cutting program. Ridiculous. It's the single most aggressive thing I've ever done in my journey as a businessman, as an entrepreneur. But I've had to do it because it's about conserving cash. And you have to conserve cash because I want to put it to you this way. When the Titanic hits the iceberg, you and I have one of three options. You can either go to the top at the deck where the captain is and stand there with him as it sinks, which is, you know, it'll be very heroic, but then you're dead. Or you can go to the hull where the hole is and you can try and plug the hole and there won't be enough buckets for that. Or you can get on a lifeboat and look for a different measure and look for some salvation. And I think this is a lifeboat scenario for many business people and many entrepreneurs. This is why you're seeing entrepreneurs downsizing, scaling down, cutting costs, because we're realizing that we've spent time building these incredible Titanics. We're headed down a very particular path, this thing we call a strategy. And we came up with a strategy and we were selling a product. We were going one direction. We hit this iceberg called coronavirus. And now it's about how many lifeboats do I have? What are the essentials that I need? And that's what I'm going to do.
On conserving cash, that leads me to another point you made in that article, and that is credit now, not later. So are you suggesting that we conserve our personal cash and use the bank's money?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. You know, banks are funny creatures, right? Because banks give you the most amount of credit when you least need it. It's an interesting thing, but you are most credit worthy when you're the least credit risk. So, you know, it's ironic, but actually the less credit you need is the most important word, not want. The less credit you need, the less credit the bank will give you, because at that instance, you are a lower credit risk. You don't need the credit. Your cash flow and you're asset heavy, right? And so one of the things I've done, and I'm you know, advise entrepreneurs to do it, is right now while you've got a great credit score and you can access credit, access it now. Don't wait until your financial situation deteriorates so much that by the time you go to the bank, you're on the back foot. Access that facility now, have it available now, so that you can tap into that facility if the situation deteriorates even further.
Now I have to ask, for some that may be concerned, who have maybe stepped out and gotten credit before, and the business plan hadn't worked like they thought, and now they are in debt due to this move of faith, if you will. How would you advise those individuals that are concerned about accruing debt, but they're not sure about the income from whatever it is that they're building?
I mean, I think that's the quintessential challenge, right? Because debt is a fixed cash flow commitment. You and I take out a debt and the bank says you're going to pay X amount of money every month. And so if you have a fixed cash flow commitment, it's usually better to have a fixed inflow commitment, right? You want inflow, and you want the inflows larger than the outflows. That's the way you want to do it. I think that if you are concerned, so again, we just got to get back to the basics here. So the first thing is, if you're concerned, ask yourself, what are the things you need, not the things you want, and get those things right. And the second thing you want to do is to then say to yourself, now that I have the things that I need, and I've been able to unlock some of this credit, when do I need to use the credit? I just want to make the point clear. Having the facility doesn't mean using that facility. And I think this is where people misunderstand the comment about credit. So I have a particular facility, but there's some that I haven't tapped into yet, and I will not tap into them until I need them. But the reason they're there is because when I need them, I don't want to go to the bank and apply and have my credit worthiness assessed at that time. I want to have my credit worthiness assessed when I'm at my strongest, not at the time when I'm at my potential weakest, right? It's a bit like, you want to ask the lady out when you're high flying. You don't want to ask the lady out, when you're at your weak. You just ask her out now and let her say yes, and then say, you're not going to go on a date in 6 months' time. That's kind of, I use that as a quip example, but I think that's the point, is you just have to think about readying yourself for the worst case scenario. I think many of us have to realize that we are in uncharted territories. These are very uncharted waters. And so a lot of what we have learned just doesn't apply anymore, which means we need to ask ourselves, what do we know that we need to forget, and what don't we know that we need to learn?
I've got to ask a question, because you have a global mindset as pertains to business. Here in the States, you go to any convenience store and just about every product you see has on the back "Made in China." And there's no secret that China is a superpower when it comes to economics, making many of the products that definitely we here in the States purchase and exchange. How did this happen? What, from your vantage point, how did China become? What strategic steps did they do from your vantage point that positioned them in this place?
There's a few things about China which people don't understand. So what we are seeing is not the rise of China, it's the re-rise of China. Many people forget that the United States was birthed in 1776, was the Gettysburg Address. So, and China is a couple of thousand years old. The Great Wall of China alone is 5,000 years old. So if you compare the US to China, you guys are kind of a teenager, right? China was the world's largest superpower in the 16th, 17th, and 18th, and parts of the 18th century. Right? The rise really of economic power in the West came in a lot of parts of the 19th and most importantly, the 20th century. And they were birthed in part by the steam engine and several other things which created the first industrial revolution and then the second, et cetera, et cetera. The literature is there and anybody can go and read it. But pre the industrial revolutions, China was the big boy in the global economic neighborhood. That's who China was. But what happened with China, and by the way, I spent some time with the Deputy Reserve Bank governor of one of the poorest countries in Africa, and I was saying exactly this to her. I was saying to her, you need to learn from what China did. Because what happened with China is they went through a period of communism, which reduced wage rates. Now, what communism does is communism says, regardless of your level of skill or specialization, you and I earn the same. So a doctor, a teacher, and a street sweeper earn the same salary. Now, as human beings, we're driven by reward and risk. So if there is no reward based on it taking a particular risk, I don't take the risk. In other words, if there is no reward for me to specialize because I'm not going to earn more, then I'm not going to specialize. And so what happened with China was because they reduced the wage rate and averaged it out across the citizenry, regardless of the level of specialization, there was a collective and a collective dumbing down is the word I'm looking for of the population. And people increasingly became less productive in the economy because there was no incentive to produce more, because even if you produced more, you earned the same, right? And so that reduced the wage rates in China, and China became one of the poorest countries in the world. There were rampant levels of poverty. It went back into in development. It became agrarian. It became rural again. And then what happened was something that's very interesting. China realized that if you're poor, that means your cost per unit of labor is cheap. Because you're poor, people who live in your country will accept lower wages. And so what China did is it industrialized some of its geographies. And around that industrialization, it began to employ Chinese citizens on low wages. And firms, capitalists by nature, look for the lowest input cost. So if there's a part of the world that you can outsource your production to because they can do it for cheaper, you will. And that's why you saw many firms around the world, many great US firms, begin to ship their production from the US to China because they could get it done for cheaper. All China did was she took advantage of her disadvantage. She recognized that she was poor, that she could earn lower wages, and then as a consequence of that, she attracted global. It's happening now with Vietnam. It's kind of really the same thing. It's the attraction of global production because the cost of production in those centers is so low. That's what China has done. But that was the first step. The second thing China did was she then went, well, now that we've got the global production here, we now need to get global development to happen here. So then they started learning the things that the rest of the world was making. Not just making them, but learning how to make them. And then they started producing their own carbon copies of those very same things, right? Which is why there were people talking about fake goods coming from China looking like real goods. That's exactly where it come from. They were producing carbon copies, proving that they can do the same thing, but cheaper. And now what we're seeing is sometimes they're doing even better than many developed countries, and they're doing it cheaper. What they did was very deliberate. It was a state-sanctioned program, and they had a low cost of input, and they made sure that they leapfrogged the rest of the world.
You said something so poignant there. You said they took advantage of their disadvantage. I'm wondering what can we pull out of this lesson when you think about China? How can we learn from their footprints in the earth?
So I think, probably the single most important the most important lesson is to acknowledge your weaknesses, right? Because you can't address what you don't accept. So you have to acknowledge your weaknesses. And once you've acknowledged your weaknesses, you then understand what are the complementary set of skills that you need to make up for those weaknesses, right? I'll tell you about myself. I'm a phenomenal visionary, great strategist. I'm great at exciting people and bringing them towards a vision. I hate administration. I hate administration with a passion. If I see a piece of paper in my table, I get a headache, right? Don't send me a 200-page report on something. My brain starts buzzing, right? So what I've learned is I've surrounded myself with people who will read a 300-page report, word for word, and who will give me the detail, the nuance that I need. Now, it doesn't mean I can't. I can. Of course I can. I spent, a decade of my life in corporate finance. I'm very good at reading those things. I just don't like doing it. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge your weaknesses. The second thing to do is to surround yourself with the skills that make up for those weaknesses. The third thing to do is probably the one that people spend the least amount of time on. Play to and amplify your strengths. If you don't play to and amplify your strengths, you're never going to win. And so a lot of us spend our time, so much time trying to make up for our weaknesses, we don't realize where we're strong. It's a bit like going to school and taking 6 subjects. You get 6 A's and you get 1 D and you start worrying about improving the D to a C and you ignore the A's that you got. What you got to do is you got to figure out, how do I make these A's A pluses, right?
Yeah.
Forget the D. And so that's kind of what the mindset, if you're great, and that's why you'll find typically great businesses have co-founders, and typically great entrepreneurs have a strong
that was so good. You talked about amplifying or playing to your strengths in this last point. You mentioned being a visionary. How did you tweak things so that you could play into your strength as a visionary? What did that look like?
So, that's a great question. So I think the most important question to ask yourself first is, what is your purpose? Like, what are you doing? I mean, I get you're in business, but what are you doing? What are you actually doing beyond the thing you're selling? Why are you doing what you're doing? What's your purpose? So I kind of went through this journey of trying to understand what my purpose was. And to understand what my purpose was, I first needed to understand what my strength is. Here's my strength, and I can simplify it for you. My strength is that I elevate. That's my strength. What that means is, if I walk into a room and the level of thinking is here, by the time I leave, it's here. If I have a conversation with someone and their level of aspiration is here, by the time we stop, it's here, right? So that's my strength. My strength is that I elevate. And my purpose is that I use my strength of elevation to empower other people, all right? And I do it in different ways. So the reason I can run a venture capital firm, and people talk about my successes in venture capital and our VC firm, I'm so excited. Our VC firm just won the best impact investment firm in Africa, right? Which is a huge thing, right? Thank you. So, but people talk a lot about our VC firm and not really about what my private equity firm does. Because in the VC firm is actually where my soul is expressed. Like that's where I'm uplifting people. I'm working with founders and entrepreneurs who are at the early stages of their businesses trying to build, right? So again, understand purpose. And then the second thing is to then ask yourself, so how do I play to win? So what is my purpose? Second question, how do I play to win, right? And that how is a very important question, right? Third question is, where am I going? What's the destination? And then the fourth question is, who's going to help me get there? Most people forget that fourth question. There's no such thing as a self-made anything. Everybody tapped into someone. You tap into a network, a resource, a sponsor, a coach, a mentor, a map, a mirror. I got to tell you, I have an incredible support network there is not a continent in the world I couldn't land in where if I didn't have food and if I didn't have money in my pocket, I would have food in my stomach and I would have a place to sleep that night. Because I've built a network of supporters and sponsors everywhere around the world. And you build that network by letting people know what you need, but also letting people know what you can give. And it's a funny thing, when people know what you need, they'll provide it for you. They'll make it available for you, especially if they have it. A lot of us own our vulnerabilities and we keep them inside and we don't share them. Now, I'm not saying share them with everybody. There are people who'll exploit them. But you've got to have a way of sifting people and making sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who want you to win. And here's a final trick for the people watching, right? Winners want winners around them. So the trick to finding a strategy to win, and the trick to winning is to find winners. Just go to the people who are winners, and usually you'll find that they're open, they're accepting, they're giving of their ideas and their thoughts and their networks, because they want you to win, because that's what they're doing. They literally are winning every single day. The short-term deterministic kind of zero-sum game players are usually the people who are not winners, because they are zero-sum game based. It's either me or you. Whereas winners tend to go, it's me and you, and if we work together, we'll amplify what we're doing.
In a recent article of the do's and don'ts of entrepreneurship, you speak kind of to this, and that was don't nurse the do-it-yourself mentality. We understand why that is necessary, because you need a team. You just mentioned that. But for those individuals who need a team, but they can't necessarily afford to pay one, how do they find good help to support the vision until they get to that place?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, woo! That's a fantastic question. I got to tell you, I think that's probably the most important question to ask entrepreneurs, which is, How do you get help that you can't afford to pay for? We're busy raising our third fund, and I've got guys working on the financial modeling for the fund. I'm not paying them a cent because I can't afford to. We're raising the fund. So, once the fund is raised, we can have a conversation. But they've got to do the private placement memorandum, which is a deeply technical legal document. They've got to do the fund modeling and the business plan, and they're doing all of it for free. How did I get that done? Two things. First, my name comes with equity and trust. So when I say to people we're doing something, they know it's going to happen, right? Second, and most important, they were excited by the vision of what we're doing. See, vision excites people, not numbers. So if you want people to help you, don't go to them and tell them, hey, I've got a business that's going to be worth $1 billion in 5 years. You go to them and say, I've got a business that's going to help 1 billion people in 5 years. That's what you do. In the most iconic speech of the 20th century, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. He didn't say he had a spreadsheet with a standard set of operating processes and a financial model. He said, I have a dream. So if you really want to rally people and pull them around you, all you need to do is have a strong vision, right? Barack Obama, when they say we cannot do it, we will answer with that question. We will answer with that monicum that's been the mark of man and hope for all time. Yes, we can. If you give people a dream, an idea, a vision of what can be done, everything else, people will marshal around a great vision, because to have a great vision, you've got to be a great leader. The details kind of take care of themselves. And that's what I meant when I said to you, I've understood my strength. My strength is in visioning, my strength is in strategy, and my strength is in leading. Then I've surrounded myself with people who are great at the detail. Great at the financial modeling, great at the administration, great at the legal and the compliance, great at the marketing, what I'm great at is we're going to change the world, and here's how we're going to do it. And once you figure out what your strength is, you just keep playing to your strength. It doesn't mean life's going to go your way all the time, but you just got to find a way of consistently playing to your strength. If you can't convince people to give you what you need, even though you can't afford to pay for it, you probably shouldn't be running a business, because it means you can't sell.
That's a mouthful, Doc. That's good. That is good. In that same article, you mentioned don't raise funds too soon. And as a venture capitalist and one who has built businesses, talk to us about that time frame. What is too soon? What does that look like?
So many entrepreneurs, many founders, many business owners raise funds for their business at the early stages of their business when they're trying to get their feet off the ground. That's the wrong time. You want to raise funds for your business once you've got your feet off the ground. What that means is once you've got, they call it in tech, an MVP, a minimum viable product, or what the rest of us in the real world call traction. So I have this idea that I want to sell this lip balm, right? Mm-hmm. But to sell the lip balm, I've got to manufacture it, right? Or to sell the lip balm, I've got to import it from China. You and I really had a conversation about how cheap it is to bring stuff in from China. So if I go to Vusi and I say, dude, I'm trying to bring in 1 million units of these lip balm, please fund me. That's not going to work. But if I go and find 10 shopkeepers, retailers, and I convince each of them to buy 100 units on consignment, right? And then I go to the supplier of the lip balm and I convince him to make available to me 10,000 of these units on consignment. That means I can get my business going without spending a cent. So he's going to give me 10,000 of these. Lip balm doesn't expire. So he's technically taking no risk. I'm going to take them and I'm going to give them to these 10 shopkeepers. They're going to start selling them. Once they pay me, I pay him. And I'll do that process a couple of times over. So by the time I go to a Vusi and say, fund me, when Vusi says, what's your financial model? I can show him how my business has performed. I can show him my customers. I can show him the feedback. I can show him my pricing. I can show him my margins. I can show him my value chain. I can show him all of those things. And then he can have a conversation with me based on the value of a business he's looking at rather than the value of the idea. The difficulty with trying to value ideas is that the person who has the idea always thinks it's worth more than it is. The person hearing the idea always thinks it's worth less than it is. And so it's hard for them to find a middle ground. Whereas once you've activated that idea a little bit, then you've got traction and it's a lot easier for things to move.
So good. In that same article, one of the do's that you say, and it was interesting to me, is you said, do fire your mentor. I know for me and many like you and I, we value our mentors. Why are we to fire them when we jump into this entrepreneur? And what does that mean?
Well, you know, mentors are like, a mentor is like a torch of light in the darkest of night, right? They, in part, their role is to light the path for you that you can't see yourself. That's why you go to the mentor, because you're in the darkness. You don't know what you're looking at. So when you change careers, or even what was the case for me, when I changed tiers, in other words, my business was at one particular tier for a long time. And many entrepreneurs go through this, where you get your business going and you're excited for the first 365 days, and then life happens, reality hits. And there's like a 4 to 5 year period of hell. The guys watching this know exactly what I'm talking about. The first year is excitement, it's passion, it's energy. And the next 3 to 4 years after that are hell, because the market changes, your team changes, people betray you, the market starts lying about you, your competitors start gossiping about you, your customers start doubting you. You start dealing with all these other external factors that weren't in the business plan. You didn't think you're going to have to deal with this stuff. And in that time, what happens is you get locked in on a particular size of business. Go and look at the revenue lines for Amazon, first 6 years, and you see flat. Facebook, flat. Even Intel, Apple, it's exactly how it should be. They're flat because in that period of time, they're going through that process of hell, of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, who stays and who doesn't, what do we keep and what do we let go. Then what happens after that is like a ray of sunshine in the morning. The skies open up. Now you've been through the hell. You yourself are wiser, you're more mature, you've learned about yourself, because the most difficult thing about going through a period of difficulty is dealing with you. Conversation we never have. The conversations we have to have with ourselves. What do you say to yourself in the middle of the night when you don't think you're going to make salaries month end? What do you say to yourself in the middle of the night when you can see your competitors beating you in the marketplace every day? How do you keep yourself going? Because a lot of us come into this and we have our own deeply held beliefs, right? And some of those beliefs are limiting. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. Why me? And so in that period of hell, the world gives you all the evidence to suggest that those deeply limiting beliefs are correct. So once you go through that, you prove to yourself that they're not correct. They're beliefs you learned at a point in time, and now you're unlearning them. Then what happens is you get into the growth phase of your business, right? That's literally why my firm is called My Growth Fund, because we work with entrepreneurs at the growth phase of their business. Then what happens is you get into the growth phase of your business. Now, the mentor who was in your life when you were going through the period of hell generally is not a great mentor when you're going through the period of growth. The reason that is because the mentor in your life at the period of hell is great at helping you with self-preservation. The mentor you need when you go through a period of growth needs to be a mentor that helps you with self-realization. Those are very different mentors. The mentor around self-preservation whispers positive messages into your mind. The mentor with self-realization whispers provocative thoughts into your mind. And if you keep the wrong mentor for the wrong stages, you're not going to have the right support that you need at that time.
So good, so good. It's no secret, anybody that's watching that is in business or entrepreneurship, that it requires a lot of sacrifice. I'm curious, you've been in this business and in this game of business for many years. What did that sacrifice look for you like in the beginning, and how does it look now, being that you've grown?
Sorry, I'm trying to not to get emotional, because I'm remembering some of those, I took deep financial sacrifices. There was a point in time when I had very little to go on. And I remember I had to live in my office because I didn't have any place else to live. So I lived in my office for months on end in the dead of winter. And I used to sleep in my car. And, you know, I'd switch the car on every 20 minutes. It was such a cold winter. I'll never forget that winter. There was a cold front. And I used to sleep in the car and I'd switch the car on every 20 minutes for 3 minutes at a time just to warm it up. And even then I didn't give up, right? That's what I was talking about the test. And that's what I was talking about. I had one pair of shoes. The pair of shoes was so worn that underneath the sole was completely gone. So I was stepping on my socks and the socks then began to tear. I had 2 shirts and exactly 1 suit. So I wore the same suit and I kept alternating the shirts. But I kept going. I didn't stop. I kept soldiering on. More recently, the biggest sacrifice that I'd made, and I wish I hadn't made it. If I'd known better, I would have done differently. I sacrificed my family. I sacrificed time with my kids. I worked so hard. I gave up so many hours that I was barely there for my kids growing up. I missed the play dates. I missed the school functions. And many, you know, business owners watching this conversation will resonate with what I'm talking about. And I want to say to business owners and entrepreneurs in this conversation, there is a price that's too high to pay. And if I had it differently, I would definitely do that differently. And now my family is priority number 1 and 2 and 3 in that order. I will drop anything that eats into time with my family, with my kids. I will not hesitate. I will not think twice, because there is just a price that's too high to pay sometimes.
Mm-hmm. What was your logic in that period, particularly with the family? Did you think, if I spend more hours here, then I would get to this place quicker? What was your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. It was work harder and you make the suffering shorter, which is a lie. You know, the suffering is a season. It's like a winter. You can sit in the corner and pray it away, but it ain't going anywhere. And you better believe every single year you were going to have cycles, and every single cycle there's going to be a winter, right? And so you best adjust yourself to living with the winter, but to presume that you can pray it away is not going to happen. So in part it was, if I work harder, then I will shorten the period of difficulty we were having at the time, and that didn't happen. In fact, it got worse, not better. But the other part, which I think many of us do, is we lie to ourselves by convincing ourselves that we're doing what we're doing for our kids. So we go, well, no, I'm doing it for them. It's for them, so that I can leave them. And yeah, but you know, my son doesn't care what car I drive. He doesn't care how much money's in the bank account. He cares that there's food on the table. He cares that his laughs are on the table. He cares that there's a chicken on the stove. He cares that dad is around, that dad reads him a bedtime story, that dad comes to his events. That's what he cares about. And then I started, you know, it really changed my mind. My son developed fever blisters. And I asked him, I said, what's with the fever blisters? And he said to me, it's just because I miss you, Dad. Man, that broke me, man. That tore me up. So yeah, just don't pay that price, guys. It's not worth it.
There is a price that is too high to pay. Wow, that resonates so well with me. As we prepare to wrap, there's so many businesses, so many lanes when it comes to entrepreneurship. From your vantage point, what are the spaces that will thrive post this pandemic?
Any business that is an essential service. So stuff people have to have: food, clothing, warmth. I think we're getting back to the basics, right? That stuff is going to thrive. The second is any business that's built around convenience. So the consumer can get it as conveniently as possible. That'll thrive. The third is any business that's built with a price point in mind. So we're moving away from spend the most amount of money to show how well off I am. We're going into preserve money and buy what I need. And so any business built around a decent price point and cost leadership, I think those are the businesses that are going to thrive going forward.
Mm-hmm. And the second part of that question, as it pertains to our topic, global entrepreneurship, how does one take their small business and scale it into a global enterprise, if you will?
It's a great question. Unlock community. Businesses are nothing more than aggregators of community activity. So when you build a business, really what you're trying to do is to aggregate people into the behavior of a particular behavior, and you aggregate those people into a community. You call them customers, right? The community is people I want to design my product, so I create a marketing campaign. I need them to be able to buy that product, so I have a distribution model. And I need that product to be appealing to them, so I price it correctly. But the behavior is the same. They've got to buy and use the product, right? And you need both the purchase and the utility. You need the buy to make money. You need the utility so that they can buy for the second time. So, if you want to build a global business, my trick and how I did it was I just built a community. So I have a community of clients in Seattle, in Pittsburgh, in Kuala Lumpur, in London, in Buenos Aires, all over the world. And all of them are my community because I've gotten them to behave in exactly the same way. So try to think of your business less as a product or a service and think of your business more as an aggregation platform for a community. One last thing I want to say to you. The reason that's important is because if your business aggregates a community, then you can easily change the product that you sell. See? Many of us battle changing the product because we think the product is the business. Nah, fam, the community is the business. The product is just the exchange mechanism, right? But the community is the business. And so if you build the community, you'll always have a business. You can pivot any direction. If you think about what is Amazon? Amazon is just a community. First, they got you and I to buy books. Then they started to get us to stream stuff. Then they started giving us web services. Now they're in Prime, but all they've done is they've taken exactly the same community and they're plugging more products in. So think of your business as a community, not as a product or a service.
So good. Before I let you go, I got to get you to play a quick game with me. And it's called my 5 favorites. So what I'll do is I'll give you 2 options and you give me your favorite of the 2. Reading or writing?
Writing.
Talking or tweeting?
Woo! Talking.
Shoes or suits?
Suits.
Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates?
Woo! Jeff, definitely Jeff.
Okay, and lastly, Boo Tea or Bunny Chow?
Bunny Chow.
For those who don't know, those last 2 are traditional South African dishes. Delicious. I'm a foodie, so I eat from all around the world right here in the States.
My man.
Well, VT, I appreciate you joining me. Listen, let our listeners know how they can connect with you and see what everything you got going on.
At Vusi Thembekwayo on all the social media platforms, at Vusi Thembekwayo. My website is vusithembekwayo.com. All my information's there. Hit me up. Let's have a conversation.
I appreciate you. My best to you and the family.
Good man. Thank you for your time.
Take care.